from the School of International Studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. Professor Singh, many thanks for joining us on the show. Now that the Congress has put this whole debt ceiling behind them, at least for a couple of years, Joe Biden's term or this term, don't know whether he'll run for the next one or not, but this term, at least this, default is taken off. What does that mean for the United States? What does that mean by extension for the world?
Thank you, Amrit. First of all, I think what is important to underline is that if any other country around the world has to either go out and do international trade or do international investments, it has to do in US dollars. Whereas for United States is their national currency. They have to use either in repayments or in international trade. Indeed, the currency of reserves around the world is also US dollar. Now, what is interesting to note here is that for about a decade or more than a decade, one has seen this weaponization of this debt default limit within US politics. So the Republicans and Democrats, which usually it is about 80 years back that the Congress had decided to put a kind of a ceiling on what government could borrow in terms of for payments of its bills. 90 times this has been revised over about 80 years, but about last 10 to 15 years, this has become a bone of contention, often used for, scoring brownie points. And now this being an election year saw a very, very different attitude from both sides. President Biden first refused to even negotiate, saying that it is the responsibility of Congress to ensure the United States doesn't have to default on its debts. And then finally, of course, negotiations happened. Lessons are that the United States is internally beginning to look like a much more divided house than it should be if it has to say as a global leader. And therefore, already, for example, in the last 20 years, there's an enormous shrink in global reserves of dollars from 71% of the total global reserves to about 47% of global reserves being in dollar terms. And of course, we are also hearing that the BRICS nations are planning to think of using more and more local currencies and of course, potentially thinking of a global currency started by these BRICS nations, etc. So I think it doesn't have only lessons for internal, kind of panic or skepticism that such tension between Republicans and Democrats based on this debt default very often creates, but has impact around the world. You just mentioned how there is a certain optimism around the world now. Stock exchanges are showing that kind of a response. So I sense that this credibility of United States over a period of time might see these tensions eroding that credibility over a period of time. Though I'm not saying that world will not invest. World still is happy to invest in United States, keep buying American government bonds as much as they want to sell. So that kind of problem of resourcing money is not a problem. Already, I think about 133% of GDP of United States is their debt, which if it happens in any other country, it's chaos and crisis. But that shows that nations are willing to invest, but nations are also becoming conscious. If nations know that this kind of debate is repeatedly going to lead to some kind of a brinkmanship, almost 1st of June, in January, they had announced that US has defaulted, and then of course with what they call extraordinary measures, the Treasury Department managed to move money from one head to another, saying we can move up to 1st of June, then 5th of June. That kind of brinkmanship doesn't create trust in other countries who are buying government bonds and giving those credits to United States. So in that sense, it will have impact on the credibility and trust of United States and on its global leadership.
All right. Professor Swaran Singh, I'll request you to stay on. Let's go across to Professor Swaran Singh. Let me come to you. Is there, what the Fed does, is that still a point of caution? Could that act as a dampener, the US unemployment figures on the world markets?
Clearly, Amrit, if you look at the two political parties that are ruling United States, the Democrats have traditionally focused on uh, pushing more money into markets to create opportunities for Americans, particularly in social security, in the employment sector, in generating all kinds of Medicare and things. Whereas Republicans have traditionally been far more conservative in not really spending beyond what is revenues raised by the government. They have been much more conservative in that sense. Now here we have a deal which is a compromise deal, which has been able to cut a lot of proposed budget expenditure of the Democratic government, even into the next year and next year. So I think some of that caution will get reflected in how Fed behaves in terms of either sustaining or even raising interest rates and sort of making availability of money in the market possible. So that caution of Republicans will get reflected even in the Democratic administration's sort of decisions in the coming year. And they have to treat very cautiously. As I keep saying, this is an election year. And if you notice the voting that happened, it seems that, lawmakers were not so much worried about party position. They are increasingly becoming conscious of their own constituencies, of their own pet projects. So in Senate, for example, which saw 63 votes in favor, whereas Democrats are only 44 votes of Democrats, and in fact, 4 Democrats also voted against it. In fact, among others, the Senator Bernie Sanders has been openly opposing it. Likewise, in the House also. What I'm saying is that cross-voting was happening, open opposition to even the compromise deal was happening. So there is going to be a certain amount of pressure on Democratic administration to stay conservative and not really, allow more money to be flooded in the market, lowering interest rates. So interest rates will be sustained definitely, but it is a possibility that they could even be raised.
All right. Let me. Professor Swaran Singh, who's won in this? When Chuck Schumer came to the House, the Senate Majority Leader, he said it's a big victory for the Democrats, 63-36. Yesterday, the papers wrote when the House voted that they credited Kevin McCarthy for that victory. Whose victory is it? Who's won in it?
I think the best will be to quote what Joe Biden said. He said neither side has got everything. So everybody has lost a little bit in the negotiations. And that indeed in diplomacy is the best deal that can arrive where everybody goes home little unhappy. But if one has to pinpoint as to who could be seen as winner, if one has to choose, then I think Kevin McCarthy would be the one. Because he was seen initially on a weak wicket, as the margins in Senate are very, very limited, 51-49. And therefore, you remember his elections also was very complicated as House Speaker, as Senate, as House Speaker.
As House Speaker, yes.
As House Speaker. So initially, the general impression was that Joe Biden was acting very tough. He was not even willing to negotiate. And that Kevin McCarthy was on a weak wicket, and now it seems that the compromise deal has achieved a good deal for the laundry list that Republicans had presented to Joe Biden. So in that sense, if one has to pinpoint, I think Kevin McCarthy would be seen as winner. And this is also primarily because Joe Biden is willing to contest next presidential elections, which Kevin McCarthy is not contesting. So in that sense, it would also be an issue of debate during presidential election debates as to how much Joe Biden had to give in. In fact, already a lot of Democrats have gone public in terms of their displeasure about the deal. So in that sense, the kind of imagination of the tough posturing that Joe Biden did and how much finally the compromise deal had to give in to Republicans, how much weak wicket Kevin McCarthy was seen playing on, and how much he has achieved. I think in that sense, this is the interesting part, how these debt default ceilings, has become kind of a ping-pong ball now between two political parties, and that's not a good sign for United States global leadership.
That brings me to To my next question, Professor Swaran Singh, how does Joe Biden go and face his electorate, his constituency, when he takes cuts on spending cuts on welfare measures? Because the progressives or the more progressives in his party said, well, this is a sellout.
Indeed, that's what I'm saying, that there are Republicans who have gone public. There are Democrats who have gone public in saying that they are not happy with the deal. In fact, among others, Bernie Sanders was going public that he's going to oppose. His conscience doesn't permit him to support that compromise deal that has been achieved. So in that sense, even when, of course, because if the sitting president is contesting, we will not have other primaries for other Democratic leaders happening. But that kind of debate still will be there as to whether Joe Biden for a second term is an ideal choice even from the Democratic side. And these are the issues that he will have to defend as to how much he gave in, or shall we say caved in finally achieving this sort of last minute weekend deal, when we had already crossed the 1st June limit, and then of course they were saying now we can stretch it to 5th of June. So the brinkmanship, I think the way it was carried out by Kevin McCarthy was really effective. And this issue will keep lingering on in the coming presidential elections as well. And that would see President Joe Biden having a lot to explain even on these issues. Of course, many other issues also he will have to explain.
True. Okay, I think, John, we've lost the audio link again with John. Let me go back to Professor Swaran Singh here. Professor Swaran Singh, let me ask you the same question I was trying to ask John.
I think it is interesting to remember how the history has played on when the United States supports European countries in their war efforts. Both in First World War and Second World War, the broader understanding was that countries that are together in any war and have been helping each other a great deal, at end of war, as they become victorious, they will really waive off all the sort of debt that one country was owing to the other in terms of being supplied by defense equipment and other help. Now, that could also be an expectation again here, because so much more has been supplied to Ukraine. And with the death and destruction that Ukraine has faced, this could be an argument. Should these countries be expecting Ukraine to pay back? And if that is lingering at the subconscious level of United States, then we'll have to see how much United States can continue to support Ukraine in this war, which is almost appearing to be unstoppable, and therefore certain amount of reluctance as well is increasingly creeping in. So we are noticing now that the President Biden is talking about creating a coalition of 50 countries to supply equipment and other things to Ukraine and not really bear the burden, by themselves alone. So that kind of issue, supporting a war in Europe, supporting Ukraine, would also become an issue of economics in terms of how much can be invested in Ukraine war by the United States. And that could also be an issue in elections, not just the politics.
Yeah, I'm particularly interested, Professor Singh, in the blue constituency. What is the blue constituency going to think, especially the blue constituency at the bottom of the ladder, when they say, well, you're taking my food stamps away, you raising my age for entitlement from 50 to 54, you don't have money to put in my pocket. How do I care if some force captures Bakhmut or not? It's far away. I don't even know where that is. How would the blue constituency, the core blue constituency, react to this?
I think you hit the nail, Amrit, here, because that is the constituency that Donald Trump thrives on. And he is going to repeatedly tell us how no major wars occurred during his presidency and how war is impacting, the policies at home and, tightening off the belt of all these people who were his supporters in that sense. So coming elections will see a lot of these economics of Ukraine war and of course what happened in this default of debt kind of ping pong ball politics. And that, I think, is something that will become an issue which President Joe Biden as a candidate then will have to explain. And of course, Republicans and particularly Donald Trump would love to raise these issues and
True.
say that these are the people who are at the receiving end of this grand posturing that America is doing in Europe in terms of saying America is bad.
All right, well, both sides claim victory. We don't know really, or we'll have to wait and see how the American public reacts to it. But for a moment, Joe Biden's administration plus the markets around the world seem to be heaving a sigh of relief. Professor Swaran Singh, thank you very much for taking your time out and lending us your insights. Thank you.